Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise on really critical global issues. And today, we're doing a deep dive into something incredibly complex, very high stakes, U.S. strategy toward Iran. We're not just scratching the surface here. We want to really get into understanding the multifaceted challenge Iran poses, especially, through the lens of U.S. policy and military thinking.
That's exactly right. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a range of sources. We've looked at, everything from candid takes on online forums, places like Reddit, all the way to these really in-depth reports from think tanks, Atlantic Council, CSIS, those kinds of places. And then there's detailed military statements, news analysis from outlets like Politico, the Maritime Executive. So it's a pretty broad picture we're trying to build for you.
Yeah, and our goal, our mission here is straightforward. We want to equip you, the listener, with the core insights you need to understand the debates happening right now around Iran, what different key players are saying, and what the potential ways forward might actually look like. And just to be crystal clear, we're not taking sides. We're not pushing any political view. Our only aim is clarity on a really vital global issue so you can form your own informed view. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so one perspective that really jumps out from our sources, especially early on, is how Iran managed to become such a significant regional power, and specifically this growing network of proxy forces. There's a pretty strong argument, you hear it in some online discussions, that U.S. actions in Iraq and Afghanistan actually inadvertently created this power vacuum. Can you maybe elaborate on that? How did removing Saddam's rule, for example, feed into Iran's rise?
Yeah, it's a really crucial starting point. There's this argument, and it's discussed quite a bit, that taking out Saddam Hussein's Sunni regime in Iraq, it unintentionally empowered Iran. It essentially pulled Iraq much closer into Iran's orbit than it had ever been before. Some people look back and see it, maybe starkly, as a kind of unintended strategic gift to Tehran from a previous U.S. administration. Afghanistan is different, of course, its own challenges, but it didn't really shift the regional balance for Iran quite like removing Iraq as a major rival did.
Right. And Iran definitely seems to have leveraged that shift, building up what it calls its axis of resistance.
Yeah.
We're talking Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq, Syria, the Houthis down in Yemen, Hamas in Palestine. These aren't small groups, are they?
Right. Oh, not at all. Their estimated numbers are, frankly, pretty significant. They pose a real challenge on multiple fronts. Hezbollah, for instance, is widely seen as a very well-armed, well-trained, non-state military force. And the money flowing from Iran, it's staggering. Hamas, estimates suggest, got maybe $70 to $100 million in 2023. Hezbollah, maybe $700 million back in 2020. And the whole network collectively could be looking at something like $6 billion for 2024. And these groups, they play a direct role in destabilizing things, targeting U.S. interests, U.S. allies. You see it with the Houthi attacks disrupting Red Sea shipping.
Which hits global commerce hard.
Exactly. And of course, Hamas's attack on October 7th. It's all interconnected.
That scale, the chaos it fuels, It brings up another point we saw in those online discussions, this deep concern about failed states. It's not just theoretical, is it?
Right.
It's a warning about, unintended consequences. What's the core of that argument? The bad regime versus chaos idea.
Precisely. The idea articulated there is that sometimes maybe even a bad regime is better than destroying the regime and leaving chaos behind. The worry is that a failed state just becomes this breeding ground, a hive for lawlessness, smuggling, and independent terrorist groups, creates even bigger, maybe less predictable threats. It really highlights the central dilemma, doesn't it? How do you deal with hostile regimes without accidentally making things even worse, more unstable? And understanding this proxy network, for you, the listener, it clarifies just how tangled these Middle East conflicts are. Seemingly local stuff, it ripples outwards, impacting global trade, global security. It affects everyone.
Absolutely. This web of proxies definitely poses a huge security challenge, which leads us right into the U.S. military posture in the region and the debates happening inside the Pentagon. The U.S. still has a pretty significant presence there, right?
Oh, absolutely. You're looking at around 40,000 U.S. personnel deployed across the region. You've got bases in key spots: Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Syria, Iraq, even Diego Garcia out in the Indian Ocean. And what really stands out recently is this rare move deploying 2 aircraft carriers, the Nimitz and the Carl Vinson, plus a lot of advanced aircraft, F-22s, F-35s, F-16s. That's a major signal, a real reprioritization. Some assets even move from the Pacific. It tells you the Middle East is, very much back in focus for planners.
And right in the middle of the U.S. approach there is General Michael Kurilla, head of CNFRICOM. Our sources paint quite a picture of him, a hawk of hawks. What does that really mean for his strategy?
Well, General Kurilla's reputation as tough and warfighter isn't just talk. It reflects a specific strategic outlook at CENTCOM. He's described as extremely strategic and persuasive when pushing for more military assets in the Middle East. He clearly believes in strong force projection, and he's experienced, earned a Bronze Star for bravery in Iraq back in 2005, was shot 3 times in a firefight. He's been pushing hard for more U.S. weapons, especially air defenses. He's also credited with this idea of Kurilla's umbrella.
Ah, yes, the integrated air defense concept.
Exactly. Linking Israeli air defenses with Arab state systems for a stronger regional shield against missiles, drones. And some sources suggest he's been quite forward-leaning within the DoD, promoting potential joint operations with the Israelis concerning Iran.
So Kurilla's pushing hard for this robust posture. But is everyone in the Pentagon on board? What kind of friction is there? Who disagrees and why?
And that's where you see the internal tensions. It's fascinating, actually. Kurilla's push for more resources often clashes with the views of people like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, or the Pentagon policy chief, Elbridge Colby. Their argument is different. They urge caution about over-investing in the Middle East. They want the focus, the resources directed towards the big strategic competition with China. You get this sense, one source put it as, CENTCOM is trying to grab every asset they can from every other theater. It really shows the different priorities, the resource tug-of-war inside the defense establishment.
And then there's the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who came in 2025. His background's pretty varied: Princeton, military deployments, Fox News commentator. How does he fit into this? His priorities, his leadership style?
Well, Secretary Hegseth has publicly stated priorities like wanting to revive the warrior ethos in the military, supporting President Trump's goal to end wars responsibly. But interestingly, our sources mention some scrutiny over his apparent deference to General Kurilla. Some observers feel it might actually undermine the civilian control Hegseth says he wants to strengthen. Perhaps he's particularly swayed by senior military leaders who project that decisive warfighter persona. And this dynamic, the push and pull between civilian leadership and military commanders, it's really crucial for you to grasp because it directly shapes how forces get deployed and the overall U.S. strategy towards threats like Iran.
Which, circling back, brings us to that idea of a land invasion of Iran. Those online discussions framed it as incredibly difficult, a potential bloodbath.
Yes, that's the strong consensus in those discussions. A land invasion, likely a bloodbath for everyone involved, probably heavier U.S. casualties than anything since Vietnam. And a huge practical problem highlighted is the lack of staging areas. Iraq, Afghanistan, they aren't occupied U.S. territories now, and cooperation with traditional partners like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia for that kind of massive offensive operation, it's seen as much weaker now. So yeah, understanding these different strategic viewpoints within the U.S. defense world, from the top civilians down to the regional commanders, is key to seeing how they approach these massive challenges.
Okay, let's pivot a bit and look inside Iran itself. Beyond its external actions and the U.S. response, our sources paint a really interesting picture of Iran's internal situation. Not just the nuclear program, but also some perhaps overlooked domestic weaknesses. First, the nuclear program. How far along is it now?
Well, they've made really significant strides since 2019, especially after the U.S. left the nuclear deal. They've got over 400 kilograms of uranium enriched up to 60%. That's almost double what they had just 6 months ago. General Kurilla has actually said publicly that with their current stockpile and centrifuges, they could probably produce enough weapons-grade material for a simple nuclear bomb in about a week.
1 week?
Roughly 1 week for the first one, yeah. And maybe enough for up to 10 within 3 weeks. The IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog, keeps reporting breaches of Iran's commitments and Iran's response. It's been defiant. They've even talked about building new, more secure facilities using more advanced centrifuges.
That timeline, 1 week to 3 weeks, that's incredibly fast. What does that mean practically for policymakers? Does it change the game compared to 6 months ago?
Oh, it absolutely ramps up the urgency. That kind of accelerated timeline means the window for diplomacy just gets smaller and smaller, and the calculations around preemption or even just robust deterrence become much more immediate, much more complex. It puts huge pressure on intelligence to monitor constantly and on policymakers to decide, where are the red lines? What are the consequences? Knowing their reaction time might be weeks, not months or years.
Wow. But it's not just this external threat potential. Iran itself faces pretty significant internal challenges, right?
Yeah.
Things that could really affect its actions.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember Iran isn't some unified bloc. There's deep, widespread public dissatisfaction inside the country. It's driven by a poor economy, corruption, serious mismanagement of environmental issues, especially water shortages, which are forcing people to move, creating social tension. And then there are the repressive social policies. Remember the woman life freedom protests back in 2022, 2023. They started over social issues, but quickly grew into calls for actual regime change. And our sources suggest there's still this ongoing daily civil disobedience.
And politically, there was the surprise election of Masoud Pezeshkian as president recently. He's described as a reformer. What should we make of that? Does it signal a real shift?
Pezeshkian's election was definitely interesting. He calls himself a reformer. He's talked about maybe re-entering nuclear talks, loosening some social restrictions. But importantly, he also pledged loyalty to the supreme leader, Khamenei. So one reading, based on our sources, is that Khamenei might have allowed his candidacy just to boost election turnout, which had been really low, and maybe, soften Iran's image internationally a bit. But underneath that, despite the new president, the trend seems to be hardliners consolidating control over the really key institutions. So a new face, yes, but the core power structure still looks very much hardline dominated. And these internal pressures, this public discontent, they're real vulnerabilities. They could definitely influence how Iran behaves externally, maybe more than whoever happens to be president. That's something crucial for you to keep in mind when thinking about U.S. policy options.
Okay, finally, let's zoom out. How does Iran fit into the bigger picture of global competition? China and Russia especially seem to play important roles here.
They really do. China is Iran's main economic lifeline, a vital partner. Even with sanctions, China buys most of Iran's oil, over $34 billion worth of crude last year, and Beijing's invested massively in the wider region too, something like $400 billion since 2005. Critically, China offers military sales with, no strings attached. That makes them appealing for countries frustrated with the U.S. system, the foreign military sales process. And another thing, China seems pretty content to mostly ignore the Houthi attacks on shipping. Why? Because the disruption actually hurts their trade rivals more, potentially giving Chinese shipping an edge.
Interesting. And Russia's relationship with Iran is also deepening.
Very much so. They signed a 2-decade strategic partnership agreement back in January. It covers security, energy, trade, even nuclear cooperation. And a key part of this is Iran supplying Russia with drones and ballistic missiles for the war in Ukraine. That's crucial for Moscow. This alliance helps Russia by pulling U.S. attention and resources back to the Middle East, away from Europe. And for Iran, it gives them a powerful friend, plus military and economic support.
Which brings us to a major headache for the U.S. in this competition, the problems with its own foreign military sales, the FMS system, how the U.S. sells weapons to allies.
Yeah, this is a really critical strategic weakness. Our sources point to unacceptable delays and significant price increases plaguing the FMS process. We're talking about real examples, prices jumping 300% after a 3-year wait, or over $1 billion being added to a single deal. It's quite something. And even when partners clearly want specific U.S. gear, like counter-drone systems, counter-UAS tech sources say the U.S. hasn't managed to deliver a single one for a decade. Now, this isn't just bureaucratic inefficiency, it's a strategic failure. When the U.S. can deliver reliably, on time, on budget, it basically pushes allies towards rivals like China, who offer easier deals. It undermines U.S. influence and creates security gaps. So for you, understanding this shows how the whole U.S. approach to Iran is tied up in these bigger global power plays and economic rivalries. It really affects international relations across the board.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really laid bare just how incredibly complex the whole U.S.-Iran situation is. You've got this volatile region, Iran's growing influence, its proxy network, those very worrying nuclear advances, its own internal issues, and all that crashing against U.S. strategic interests and this wider global competition.
Exactly. And what we've seen across these different sources is this tension. On one hand, you have strong calls for more pressure, maybe even military options against Iran. But on the other hand, equally strong arguments for supporting internal reform in Iran, for addressing the root causes of instability in the region. Alliances are clearly vital, the sources emphasize that, but we also see the real challenges the U.S. faces internally in keeping those alliances strong and just delivering on its promises.
So, lots to think about. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We've talked about the history of unintended consequences from interventions in the Middle East, remembering that argument some sources made about a bad regime sometimes being better than total chaos. So the question is, how can the U.S. realistically balance that immediate need to deter Iran right now with the longer-term goal of building real stability in the region, and maybe supporting the aspirations of the Iranian people themselves for change? what actions, or maybe even deliberate inactions, could actually lead to a more stable outcome for you and for the world down the road. Something to consider.